were ballet dancers. She said they obviously had to work too hard practicing to be ballet dancers to get involved in politics in any way. So increasingly at state dinners and other events, the entertainment would be ballet. And people began to comment. They didn't realize how much Lyndon Johnson really enjoyed the ballet. She talked a lot about the planning for state dinners and how everybody, including the Democratic National Committee, wanted to get in on deciding who was going to be there. And she would have to deal with various undersecretaries of this or that who'd want to have special groups. And she said they always wanted to invite the same people. She said nobody wants to see the same people always. She was always looking for other folks to invite. And they had a group in the White House called the military aides. Now, they had nothing to do with the military. They were in the military. And they volunteered to come to the White House to be extra men for events. So they would come and greet somebody who was coming in by themselves, show them around, they would dance with them, and then they would depart when the dinner came because the White House wasn't paying for their dinner. One of them, by the way, was Brian Lamb, who went on to found C-SPAN. He was more than happy to talk about his experiences. And he remembered Bess very fondly because, as I say, the White House didn't provide for food for these military people, but Bess did. She made sure that anything was left over, it was extra from the dinner, was brought into the kitchen, and that's where the military aides and sometimes the Johnson daughters would be having dinner together, and Bess would be in there as well. She tells the story about that she was sitting in there with the military aides when a waiter came running in and said, "Bess," said, "the president says the meat is rotten." So she went running right out to his table and she said, "Mr. President, what's the problem?" And he said, "Look, I cut into the meat and this oozed out." She said, "Mr. President, that's foie gras." She said, "These are tornadoes. They're meant to be this way." And so Johnson said to the rest of his table, "It's okay, you can eat the meat." So it's keeping up with, Johnson had other things on his mind other than what was on the menu that particular day. She also talked about how people didn't want to sit next to other people at the receptions. They'd sat next to them previously, and they'd reported them as being a pincher. There were problems with pinchers back in the 1960s at state dinners. Then there were people who didn't like where they were assigned to be seated. So they would come in early and they would move the nameplates around, for instance, and she had wonderful stories. They're really in many ways, her book is a manual for White House social secretaries. And in fact, at her memorial service, there were 9 former social secretaries who came and remembered her as sort of their mentor who had gotten them through a lot of those unexpected events. I suspect that much of this is pretty much the same. There are certain things that go through constantly. There is a problem, for instance, when you have a particular guest at a state dinner, and you bring that guest in, and then you have the entertainment, but the entertainers haven't necessarily synced their entertainment with the guests. And once they had British Prime Minister Harold Wilson, and just at the point when the British had devalued the pound, it was very controversial. It was going to cost Wilson his position as Prime Minister. And Robert Merrill, the opera singer, sang, "I've got plenty of nothing." Fortunately, Wilson had a good sense of humor, and it wasn't as much of a crisis as it might have been otherwise. But there were many times in which she would be chewed out by the National Security Advisor and some of the others by saying that she didn't realize what kind of situation that the guests were actually in. Terry and I found that her interviews really told the story. They carried it through, but there were lots of gaps, things that she didn't say, or that that we remembered her telling us, but she hadn't recorded. And that's why we went out to find interviews that other people had done, particularly down here in Kentucky, and maybe somebody in the audience who gave one of those interviews. And if you are here, I'm very grateful for that, because we patched them together. And then we conducted a few other interviews. Terry had interviewed Earle Clements, Bess's father, years before. And so we knew these people, and we had to figure out how we could tell the story without us intervening in the story all that much. As I say, we heard many of these over at the dinner table at Bess's house. The Johnson administration came to an end in 1969, and Bess tells the story about the Johnsons wanted to leave a present for the White House, and so they created a children's garden, and it was extra money that was in the campaign kitty, I guess, and because it's January when the president's leaving office, and so this little garden with a pond was dedicated in January of 1969. And the Johnson daughters brought their children. And so there were several grandchildren at this occasion. One of them was about a year and a half or 2 years old. And he promptly fell into the pool in January in Washington. And Bess had to take her coat off and wrap him up and run him into the White House. So that's the kind of experiences that she had. They say in Washington that there's no such thing as a second act. And Bess actually had a very good second act. She came back in the Jimmy Carter administration, and she was Joan Mondale's chief of staff. Mrs. Mondale was the vice president's wife. And she was, even though the Mondales were in government and they'd been around, they were kind of naive about what was going on in Washington. And they hired Bess especially because she knew what things were happening. And in fact, when they had gone to their first White House reception, it had been Bess who'd gone out of her way to make them feel comfortable. And that was the reason that they were very anxious to get her on board. And Bess tells a story about campaigning with Joan Mondale. They're staying in a hotel together, and Bess was down the hall. She came up early in the morning. She knocked on Joan Mondale's door. And when the door opened, she looked over Mondale's shoulder and she said, "Has a maid already come? They've made your bed?" And Joan Mondale said, "Oh, no, I always make my own bed." Well, Bess rushed into the room and she grabbed the sheets and she pulled the bed apart and she threw everything around. She said, "You never do that." She said, "The maid is going to wonder where you were last night." So it was a good education along the way. And she also helped Joan Mondale become known as Joan of Art because they turned the vice president's mansion into a center for American arts and crafts. And Bess involved herself in quite a few other events at the time, including the Gridiron Club. You may have heard of the Gridiron Club. It's a very elite journalist club. Every year they host the president and they basically sing songs parodying the president and other famous people in Washington. They only have 60 members. For years, they were only men, and only men were invited to the Gridiron Club, despite the fact that increasingly women were journalists in Washington, including Katharine Graham, who is the publisher of the Washington Post, was not invited to these dinners. And so for a number of years, the women went out and picketed outside and tried to embarrass the men coming in, and that didn't work. So Bess organized a counter Gridiron dinner. And so on the night of the Gridiron dinner, she had a big fair, essentially a country fair. And she invited all of the most famous people she knew. Dan Rather, the broadcaster, had a kissing booth. Martha Mitchell, if you remember, who is the wife of the attorney general, who's always making midnight calls. She would, for $5, she would call anybody you knew, and she would talk to them for a little while. It turned out that more famous people and more presidential candidates went to the women's party than went to the Gridiron dinner. And the men suddenly realized that they were beaten, that the women could throw a better party than they could. And the next year was the first year that they admitted Helen Thomas as the first woman member and women guests at the Gridiron dinner. So that's the way Bess was created. And there's another story there that back in the White House days, Lyndon Johnson wanted an event for the children of the members of Congress. He said, they all care about their kids and we don't do anything for them. So Bess organized a country fair on the White House lawn. And she had rides and she had booths set up and she had a fortune teller's booth set up. And she needed fortune teller's equipment. And she called a theatrical equipment company and she asked for a crystal ball. And the guy said, okay, where should I send it? And she said, send it to the White House. And the man said, okay, but tell the president it doesn't really work. So she adjusted to what was needed, and she was constantly at work on this. By the way, she would always bring her grandchildren back to Kentucky to go back to see the roots, even though they didn't live in Kentucky. And she'd also bring them back to the U.S. Capitol to show where she had started and where her father had worked. And I remember one year taking Bess and one of her grandsons on a tour of the Senate wing of the Capitol. And we went to her father's old office on the 3rd floor of the Capitol. We walked in the door and she said, the furniture is in exactly the same place now as it was then, a half century before. And the woman who was working there at the time said, oh, it's a small room and there's not much you can do with where you can put the desks and everything. And then Bess looked around and she said, but where's the bar? And the woman who was working there very sheepishly opened up a credenza, which was fully stocked. And that was what her father was famous for, was what they called it a well. And at the end of the day, certain senators would go to the well and they would sit with Earle Clements and have a drink. And it's good to know that there are still wells left in because a lot of legislation actually gets worked out after 5 o'clock or after 6 o'clock in the Capitol. And it was part of the culture that she had grown up in, that she was so conscious of, and that she wanted her children to be aware of as well. I enjoyed knowing Bess. I learned a lot of things, one of which was never order anything that wasn't made in Kentucky and call it bourbon. She was very insistent with waiters who brought her the wrong thing, and she talked about how do you make something positive out of a situation that is essentially negative. And let me close with a wonderful story about the White House china. Now, you'd think there's nothing dramatic about the White House china. Each presidential administration orders a new set because there's a lot of wear and tear on the older ones. And Lady Bird Johnson ordered 320 place settings from Tiffany's. And they arrived one day. Most of it looked beautiful. They were so pleased until they got to the dessert plates. And Bess was appalled, and Lady Bird Johnson was appalled. They called down the president of Tiffany's. He took one look and he was appalled. And he agreed that Tiffany's would make 320 new dessert plates to add to this. Now, the rub here is that the White House can't give away or sell anything that is part of its collection, that it's acquired. So what are you going to do with 320 really ugly dessert plates? So Bess arranged, she made a picture of daiquiris. She posted on the wall in the basement of the Capitol a portrait of the White House chief of staff, who gave everybody a lot of trouble. She invited down her friends. There was a stack of dishes, and she said, heave away. And they broke 320 plates against the wall in the White House basement. So this was the Bess Abell story. She also tells a story about how at the very last days of the Johnson administration, when the Nixon people were coming in, measuring the carpet and the drapes and all, basically Liz Carpenter and Bess Abell had another picture of daiquiris on their desk and was sitting there telling the same stories I've been just telling you, and laughing and laughing. And the Nixon people, who were a lot more staid, came to the door and said, how long has this been going on? And Bess said, for 5 years. Can you believe it? For 5 years. This is what we've been doing. So it was a great project for Terry and me to do. Both of us do oral history. My wife, Anne, is an oral historian as well. We really wanted to capture the spirit of this person in the book. And I think if you read the book, you'll find that Bess tells it herself. I wish we could have had an audio version of that book. The interesting thing about oral history is it's being done all over the place. We wanted to be fair. We weren't trying to present just a vanilla portrait. We wanted to show the full side of what was going on at the time. And one of the incidents, one of the more unpleasant incidents that took place involved Eartha Kitt, the entertainer. You may remember this. She came to the White House for one of Lady Bird Johnson's lunches, and she stood up in the question period and criticized the war in Vietnam. And it made newspaper headlines and all the rest of it. Lady Bird Johnson was very upset about it. Bess was very upset about it. And so we put the story in the book as Bess and Liz Carpenter and Lady Bird, and also the White House curator told the story. And then I thought, well, has Eartha Kitt ever told the story? So I went to YouTube, and there was an oral history, a video oral history with Eartha Kitt telling her side of the story. And in fact, it's a different side of the story, one of which is when she sat down, some of the other women who were there said, we're glad you spoke up. Our husbands work in this administration. We couldn't speak up, but we're glad somebody did in the process. And so you get the tensions that were going on. And we were able to use that excerpt from that interview. As I said, the University of Kentucky, the University of Louisville, the Filson Historical Society, the Kentucky Historical Society have all got a past in oral history. And many of the people in the audience are people who were interviewers for those projects. And they were doing these interviews 30 and 40 and 50 years ago without realizing that we would be coming back to use them ourselves. And that in another 50 years, other people will be coming back to use these things. It's a wonderful resource. I always said it was the best part of my job at the Senate. That was spending time with people who were there in places where I wasn't, telling me what was really going on as opposed to what I thought had been going on at the time, and really getting to know them. And you get to know people like Bess and Tyler Abell as a result, and you never can tell what's going to come out of it. So that's the story of Bess Abell. As I say, it's very much rooted in Kentucky, and I think she would be extremely pleased that you're all here tonight for this talk. Thank you very much.
If you have any questions, please come up to this mic or the one over there. I'll get us started. With such a demanding job, what can you tell us about her personal life? Did she have a personal life?
Yes, as a matter of fact, she did. She had two small children, one of whom was named Lyndon, by the way. They were young boys when she was just 30 years old when she went to work at the White House. And they both told us in their interviews that she would slip away from state dinners to go into a private part of the White House, get on the phone and call them and read them bedtime stories from the White House. So here she was, all dolled up as best possible, and trying to make everybody happy. And they're all in there eating, and she's inside, telling these stories to her children. Her son Lyndon tells the stories that when he would get out from school, sometimes he would be dropped off at the White House, and he would go. He had the run of the White House. He just had a great time. He's probably about 8-year-old boy at the time. And one day he went running in, and one of the Marine guards just grabbed him by the collar and said, "Where do you think you're going?" And the other Marine guard said, "Oh, that's okay. That's Lyndon. You can let him in." And what is this? But he had a great time, although Bess did put her foot down when her mother-in-law wanted to take the two boys outside picketing the White House. She said, "My son Lyndon is not going to go picketing the White House at this time." Any questions? Yeah.
Butterflies are very fragile creatures. Iron butterflies would not fly.
Right.
Why the title?
Right. Well, the Secret Service gives a code name to all the top people at the White House. So they can say they're coming, they're going, they're doing this, they're doing that. Bess was a Southern lady, gentle, soft-spoken, pleasant, happy to entertain you. But she had an iron backbone. She got what she wanted done, and she put out the orders. Those military staff people were known as Abel's Army. So she was, as a result, the Secret Service named her the Iron Butterfly, and it was a very appropriate title. Yes.
You mentioned Helen Thomas,
Yes.
who also has Kentucky connections and roots. Are you aware of any interactions between Bess and Helen Thomas?
Yeah, Helen Thomas covered the White House. She went to the White House when the Kennedys were in, because she followed Mrs. Kennedy everywhere. Merriman Smith, who was the chief correspondent for the UPI, did not like women correspondents, but he had to admit that Helen Thomas had an in somehow with first ladies. And so she came in being able to cover women, but she worked her way into being able to cover the men and the politics. I got to know Helen Thomas very well in Washington and interviewed her for another book that I was doing. She was there. She was sort of a thorn in the side, because she was writing the truth. But she wasn't the person who really gave Bess the most trouble. The one who gave her the most trouble was her father-in-law, and that was Drew Pearson, the newspaper columnist. And he was the stepfather of Tyler Abell. And he was always on the lookout for people who were, doing what they weren't supposed to do. And he had, ever since the FDR administration, he kept an eye on the children of presidents who were, for the most part, he felt, exploiting their famous relatives' position. Nothing's changed in many ways. And he really lambasted the Johnson daughters from time to time. And Bess would come home just absolutely furious. Why did you write that? He'd say, well, it's my job to do this. And, it's true. I've got the evidence on that. You shouldn't have written that. You just caused a lot of trouble in the process. I didn't talk about the White House weddings, and I should have done that. And that is both of Johnson's daughters got married in the 1960s. And Bess Abell, who had eloped and hadn't had a wedding, wound up planning the weddings for both Linda and Lucy. Lucy got married in 1965. She was 19 years old at the time. She said she got to pick the groom, and she got to pick the date, and she got to pick the church, and Bess got to pick everything else. And she said that was okay, because if Bess said something, she knew that her mother would approve of whatever it was. There were a number of unforeseen situations with Lucy's wedding, one of which was that she really loved a dress that was made by Priscilla of Boston. But Priscilla of Boston was a non-union shop. And Lyndon Johnson was strongly supported by the Ladies Garment Workers Union. And the president of the Ladies Garment Workers Union called up Lyndon Johnson and really protested. Bess knew that she had to solve this. So Bess had another dress made in a union shop. And then she cut out the union label and sewed it in the Priscilla of Boston dress. And as she said, something borrowed, something blue, that. So that Lucy went down the aisle wearing a dress with a union label in it. That was also, it was in August. Lucy was getting married at the Shrine of Immaculate Conception. And it was very hot, and the shrine is not air conditioned. American Airlines was on strike at the time. And so American Airlines offered these enormous fans that they had because they weren't using them. And that would cool down the church. And that was fine until the Secretary of Labor called up and said, they're on strike. You can't be getting stuff from the American Airlines. And Lyndon Johnson at that point called Bess and said, if there's a mistake that hasn't been made yet, it's because you haven't thought of it. That was the harshest he was in talking to her. Later on, we do have one of his conversations with Bess, and she's explaining how she's going to do something. And he ends it by saying, I'm so glad you're a can-do gal. And that's what he thought of as a can-do gal. Well, they didn't use the fans. The shrine was incredibly hot. Several of the bridal party fainted in the middle of the wedding, but that Bess couldn't control that in any way. Bess did say that she also had to work out the arrangements for where does the president's daughter go on honeymoon. And so she actually went down to the Bahamas to look at a place that they were going to stay in, and they get it already. Lucy Johnson in her interview said, when I got married, there were 4 of us in that honeymoon. There was me and my husband. there was a Secret Service agent, and then there was Bess. She just sort of hovered over us because she had made all the decisions of what we were going to be doing. Linda Johnson got married 2 years later. As Linda still ruefully says, the war had gone on, and the Johnsons weren't as popular in 1967 as they were in 1965. So Lucy got much nicer presents along the way. I think she felt it. And there was Bess she borrowed walkie-talkies from the CIA. She had her people stationed all over the White House, and that wedding was in the White House, and the reception was there as well. Linda Johnson told me it was very difficult to stand on a receiving line with her father, Lyndon, because he wanted to talk to everybody who came through. So there she was standing there, and he was talking and talking, and the line would get backed up in the process. But they would always turn to Bess, the two daughters, and say, "Well, what did you do?" And then say, "Oh, you didn't do anything. That's right, you ran away." And it's but those were the kinds of jobs that a White House social secretary can get involved in. One other, if there's not another question at this point, but there's one other story, by the way, about unusual things for White House social secretaries to do. And one was in 1964, when Lyndon Johnson was running for re-election. He had signed the Civil Rights Act of 64, and he was very unpopular in the South as a result. But Lady Bird Johnson felt that she was Southern and Johnson was Southern, and they should remind Southerners of that. So Liz Carpenter and Bess Abell arranged for a train for Lady Bird Johnson to make an historic, path-breaking First Lady's Whistle Stop tour through about 8 Southern states, starting in Virginia and ending in New Orleans. And Bess found an old train. They decorated it. They got everybody on it. They went from stop to stop. They noted as the further south it went, Lady Bird Johnson's accent got deeper and deeper, reminding people how Southern she was. When she got to New Orleans, Lyndon Johnson flew down. He was so happy that the trip had gone so successfully. And he wound up carrying several of those states that people didn't think that he had a chance of carrying in 1964. So I think Lady Bird Johnson contributed to that. If you read, by the way, the histories of that election, it's that the Lady Bird Johnson special is not mentioned because it's the men who wrote the stories, and the women's part of it was that important. But Bess and Liz Carpenter and Lady Bird Johnson realized that they had a position to uphold as well. And that's what she could be called on for just about anything that the Johnson needed.
We have a question from our virtual audience. What was best impression of Jacqueline Kennedy?
Yes, the Johnsons were a little nervous about the Kennedys. They'd gotten beaten by the Kennedys. Mrs. Kennedy was so elegant, and some of her entertaining at the White House is still famous. The night they had all of the American Nobel Prize winners come to dinner, for instance. So it was a hard act to follow. And especially because you have Lyndon Johnson, who's known as sort of this cowboy from Texas. So he put a ban on any barbecue for a while. And Bess was always disappointed that they couldn't it wasn't until the very end of the administration that they had a couple of barbecue events. And people said, why haven't we been doing this all along? But Johnson didn't want to be perceived this way. Certainly, Lady Bird Johnson had stood in for Jackie Kennedy on many occasions. Mrs. Kennedy didn't like doing a lot of the meet and greets that would come, and they would call Mrs. Johnson, and she would go down to the White House to stand in for Mrs. Kennedy. But when when John Kennedy was assassinated, the Johnsons were incredibly solicitous to Mrs. Kennedy. They let her stay as long as she wanted before they moved into the White House, and they tried very hard to keep on the best side of Mrs. Kennedy, but it was a too raw situation, and it was very difficult to do. But Bess was very conscious of the style that Mrs. Kennedy had set, and did her best to emulate that. And they did have some spectacular events, including the first outdoor state dinner. And fortunately, the weather was perfect. It was under full moon, and it was just the right thing to do. So they broke a lot of barriers in doing new things as well, just as Mrs. Kennedy had done that as well. Previous to that, there was an older school of first ladies, which basically, except for Eleanor Roosevelt, the job of the first lady was to stand behind the president and smile. essentially. And Lady Bird Johnson was one of the people who really wanted a different focus. She was very big on environmentalism. The men called it beautification. Mrs. Johnson hated that title, but it was really environmentalism. And she also set up a women's doers group. They would have these luncheons for women who were active, or college presidents, or other jobs to get together. So Mrs. Johnson, that's why Mrs. Johnson wanted a social secretary and a press secretary to handle all of those things. She didn't want to have to worry about the menu, and she didn't want to have to worry about the seating. She wanted to have somebody who she could trust who would take care of all that for her.
Well, if there are any more questions, then please join me in another round of applause for John.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.